Welcome back to Read Poems Every Day. We're going to wrap up our study of Wallace Stevens's Of Mere Being today. In a previous video, I counted some beans, listened for sound and sense, but now I think we're going to move on and think a bit about form and figures. As I record this, I'm in the middle of attempting to juggle both a new Instagram page for this that's attached to this YouTube channel, where I'm going back and posting clips of my earliest videos, and it's really interesting to see how variable, as I go back through those earlier clips, how variable my tone of voice is, where the microphone is, and I know over 30 videos in now, I'm still sort of finding my feet, as it were. So, uh, anyway, I'm getting a bit of a chuckle looking back at myself. What made me think of that is the one I posted on Instagram today was my uh, getting started video on this step of the process of slowly getting to know a poem. I had a friend the other day when I was trying to describe these phrases I have for talking about the purpose of the channel. He smiled and looked at me and said, "It sounds like you're going on a date with these poems." And I thought, in a sense, that's kind of the vibe I'm going for, but without, I mean, hopefully without any kind of creepiness attached to that. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see. On a date with Wallace Stevens. Then Let's get back to it. Form and figures. As a reminder, when I was going over the prose sense of the poem, Stevens proved to be, as he often is, pretty resistant to this kind of step. It's often very difficult to get a sense of a prose sense in the poem. And so you end up saying things that are very abstract, like in the first stanza, there's a statement of an object or a statement about an object that inspires a speaker's active description. That's incredibly vague, right? Very different from the kinds of uh, descriptions that I've come up with in earlier videos about other poems. But even so, we might think of Stevens as a kind of intermediary step on the way towards something like visual poetry or even concrete poetry, where you don't have the kind of organization of verse lines into stanzas. You don't necessarily have a clear situation. You have something very different going on. And so when I'm dealing with a text like Stevens or a text like a visual poem or a concrete poem, I have to kind of revise my expectations or ambitions for this kind of step. Okay, statement of an object looks to a second object that's related. That's the bird in stanza two. Stanza three, which I was kind of slow to kind of uh, wrap my head around at first. I think I was, for some reason, in my head skipping over this pronoun and not realizing that it referred back to the poem or back to the tree or back to the bird's song or back to the aggregate of all of those images. And so I thought it was saying something like, it isn't reason itself that makes us happy or unhappy, but no, it's saying that then that these things are not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. But even then, the phrasing is so strange. Again, pretty typical of Stevens, especially in his latter work, which is pretty bare. Uh, a lot of his early poems, if you go back and read poems from Harmonium, but even from his sort of middle work, you see it's incredibly vibrant with imagery. Here, even though we have some vibrancy, again, the poem is so tight and spare that it's hard to get a grasp on anything, and so that often leads to these interestingly strange sentences and phrases. Then again, all right, so I've gone on for almost 5 minutes just rehearsing what I've already written. The poem ends not with kind of elaborating a significance to these images that are appearing, on the edge of space or at the end of the mind, but instead just settles back into other kinds of descriptions. And the last line seems, and maybe this is maybe something where we can begin thinking about form. Let's think about the function of the last line, uh, 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 and its pressure on the poem, on the poem. So it is explicitly hyper alliterative in a way that the poem is not. You'll see that, most of the sonically pleasing moments in the line for me are pretty um, tied to just a couple words until you get to line 12, and then you get this incredible conclusion. I'm going to read it again. The birds' fire-fangled feathers dangle down. Just what on earth? So good. So we might think about the function of this last line and its pressure on the poem, the fact that it's explicitly hyper alliterative, a kind of reinforcement, maybe, of hmm, the sonic pleasures of poesis. So a reinforcement of poesis as a as an activity that does not always require reflection on human significance. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. All right. The last line also seems in odd tension or relation to the title. The mereness, the mere of the title, mere being, contrasts, oops, with the brilliance. And I mean that in sort of both senses. Brilliance as in sort of super smart, exemplary, but also brilliance as in light, right? And shiny. The brilliance of the final line. But then again, the final line settles into description about the bird and not into, let's say, figuration of the bird. Let's not say figuration, into personification, maybe, of the bird. And this might get us to then thinking about, if figures of speech are operative here, is there even any figurative language in the poem? I think there is, of course, um, but not the kind that, say, extracts non-human objects from the world in order to turn them into expressions of human significance. At least maybe that's the ambition of the poem. If we press hard enough, though, it does seem that Stevens is up to something that is still deeply human, right? Is still deeply human despite the ambitions of the title. Just mere being, not human being. Of mere being, not human being. Right. Okay. Okay. But the bird and palm, while not figures of human being, are still oddly used as figures of this mereness, mere existence, mere existence, right? they're not personified in order turning them into exemplary expressions of something human, but they are examples of a sort. Their non-humanness, non-humanness. All right, let's go back just to show you without human meaning, without human feeling. So the poem does emphasize the ways that the palm tree maybe, and the bird aren't human, right? So their non-humanness, this quality is leveraged, is leveraged to turn them into signs of bare existence, of bare existence. Is that right? Is that what's going on here? It's one way to try to understand the relationship and how the title pressures the last line, the last line pressures the title, and then also the significance in that second stanza of the poet's refusal to assign, um, I don't know, desperation, sadness, poetic ambition to the song of this gold feathered bird. And what's so interesting, all the early shiny imagery might traditionally might traditionally make readers expect something like personification. The shininess might usually invite some kind of human animal comparison, or some kind of some kind of personification of the animal, of the animal as a sign of the human condition, sign of the human condition, or as a sign of the human condition's limitation. So you might think, for instance, of some romantic poems that address themselves to birds, and sometimes those birds stand in as kind of secondary poets, or poets of another kind. But then in the same poem, the poet might then sort of break out of that fantasy and talk about the ways in which the bird is so sort of utterly superior in some ways to the poet's own groundedness and limitation. The poet can't fly. The poet can't, you know, pick up and move across a hill or a mountain, um, which is a kind of course, fantasy, of course, a fantasy of the mobility of a bird too, and what a bird is capable of, though they are capable of a lot. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I hope what I'm saying makes sense. That Stevens, by referencing the poem, referencing the bird, situates the poem in a long lineage of poems that talk about these similar kinds of images, but then also kind of refuses the moves of those other of that tradition. And yet, in doing so, the bird, the poem, the shininess of it all still ends up getting turned, troped, figured as a kind of mereness, right? A mere existence, which is another way, in some ways, to cancel their singularity. But I don't know. I'm not saying that to pick on Stevens. I'm just that is maybe the kind of trap that verse poetry, lyric poetry, kind of gets one into when you still insist on conventions like alliteration. Um, the convention of figuration sort of still brought with it, even if it's sort of pushed back on. The bird sings, its feathers shine. There's the shininess. I was wondering, am I injecting this sense of shininess into it? Even if there is these references to precious metals here. Okay, so form and figures. Got some thoughts here about those. There's still figuration happening. And then there's also a kind of way in which these phrases like on the edge of space, at the end of the mind, are also figurative. They stand in for what? A life uh, drawing near its end, maybe? Old or older age? Um, in a certain vocabulary drawn, I think, from Adorno, continued through writers like Edward Said, a kind of lateness, right? A lateness. Um, in my own work on Stevens, this is sometimes what I describe as borrowing from Said and Adorno, the kind of late style of Stevens, which we see in this poem, uh, especially as I think the last poem he wrote. Okay. I wonder too about the no, I think no, we'll maybe save that for ideas and questions. No, I think it's right for it is a formal issue. Um, the function of the penultimate line that draws in the wind. You know, there is a kind of anaphoric structure to the final stanza. I think I was kind of on the edge of saying something like this in my previous video when I noticed the frequency of periods in the last two stanzas. There's six of them in the last two stanzas and only one period here. And so you have a different kind of structure announcing itself. Um, announcing itself. You have, the X, Y's, right? So the noun verbs is sort of how these last three lines begin. The palm stands, the wind moves, the birds fired, feathers dangle down. Of course, that last one really is drawn out and expanded um, through that sort of hyperbole of alliteration that alliteration makes possible and affords. So, going back to that idea of the wind, though, I got distracted by possibility of anaphora in that last stanza. I mean, such a small detail, but in a poem of not many details, it's the first time this detail appears right near the end. Right near the end. Because there is no reference to the wind before that, right? No. If you know the poem "The Snowman," of course, the wind features in there in in pretty significant ways, and that would actually be an interesting partner poem to read alongside this one. But we won't get into that just now. It's the first time this detail appears right near the end. I'm going to cross-reference here the snowman. Is snowman two words or one word? We'll leave it like that. It's possible if you've taken an American literature survey class or a class on 20th century poetry, it's very possible you've read The Snowman before in a class, or just on your own if you're reading poetry on your own. Okay, ideas and questions. Ideas and questions. Hmm. That pause required a sip of coffee, apparently. Where is the speaker standing? Is the edge on the horizon of the speaker's perspective? Or are they too on or at the edge? What relation between happiness, unhappiness, and mere being is practiced or theorized in the poem? What relation too between meaning and feeling and being? I know these are kind of hopelessly, maybe hopelessly abstract questions, but that's often where I kind of go with Stevens, that he's hmm. I mean, this is drawing on past work on Stevens. What kind of spiritual exercise does this poem offer? I argue in sort of past scholarship that especially Stevens' late poems are kind of offered or written, and I'm not saying he necessarily had this in mind, but let's say they can be read as these spiritual exercises that as readers, when you read them and sort of work your way through them, that they become these kind of thought experiments that regardless of your own age, however long you've been alive, you start to picture yourself in the kind of place and position that's being described here. um, what does it mean to see the edge coming, or what does it mean to feel oneself at the edge? um, and that one can feel that way for all kinds of reasons. Maybe one is ill, maybe one is kind of really stressed out, maybe someone is elderly, um, and feel a sense that life has passed and it's going to be gone soon. And it does seem to me that the poem is engineered to kind of get us in that headspace and to hmm, I've been reading a lot of Lauren Berlant too. That might not mean anything to everybody, but I've been reading a lot of Lauren Berlant lately, and they use a language of a kind of unlearning or loosening one's sort of hold on on the kind of organization of one's life, while at the same time trying to kind of keep hold of life. And I wonder if there's a dynamic that's kind of like that going on here in the poem, where whatever for whatever reason the speaker is observing or feeling himself at the end of the mind or on the edge of space, there's a way in which, in just looking at the palm, looking at the bird, imagining the palm, imagining the bird, and trying not to attribute human meaning or human feeling to those images or objects, there is a kind of process of unlearning, of kind of loosening the pressure to always assign significance um, to the world, or to give name to a feeling. Um, I hope I'm making sense and not going mad here. Um, but I think this is kind of what the poem is after. even the idea of happiness or unhappiness, these are names we've given to certain emotions or state of affairs. Um, there's a way in which, when given that the poem doesn't even mention us in the last stanza, doesn't mention meaning, doesn't mention feeling, there's a way in which it's maybe attempting to kind of let something just do its work. But I'm still wondering about that last line. It might not reference us, it might not reference feeling, but it's certainly looking to have an effect of sorts. And is that effect for the speaker? Is that effect for us? Is it performing the the affordances, the pleasures of a spiritual exercise of mere being? I don't know. All right, I think that's probably all I need to go into. I didn't write down all those notes, but maybe I'll have to come back and think about what it was I was saying, regretting posting it on YouTube probably. Context. Readers, I always go through some of this quickly because my answers to what context matter to me are kind of always the same. Stevens scholarship. Stevens scholars and scholarship is really where it's at for me. Since I am a critic and a scholar, that's often where I go. Um, hmm. Scholarship on spiritual or religious poetry. I think that also is something I would want to think about. What about self culture? I don't know, to be honest here. Hmm. Right. I mean, I hate to sort of force this onto the poem, but I do think it matters that I keep coming back to thinking about Stevens's late work with respect to the problems of growing older. And so older age seems to be an aspect of identity or culture that seems to matter to Stevens in some ways. But also, and maybe this is getting a bit too more not too biographical, but more biographical than I tend to with Stevens. He is quite sick at, when he writes this poem. He has cancer, though I think his family kind of kept from him the severity of the cancer, but it's hard not to think he would have been aware that he was dying or getting quite sick. Um, but we'll just kind of say fatal illness, fatal illness, right? Okay. Fatal or terminal, maybe terminal illness. Okay. Okay. Also, then, uh, concepts. What concepts? Um, Late style is one I often come back to. Figuration, defiguration, something that um, I might come back to. Late style being something, again, Said Adorno write about. There is a whole discourse about late style out there. Um, Figuration, defiguration. So I'm thinking of someone like Paul de Man, for instance, who writes a bit about this. Um, Maybe something in the medical humanities. I'm kind of curious if folks in the medical humanities have written a bit about poetry from this angle, and so that might be something to look into. Okay. I don't want to medicalize the poem. That's not necessarily what I'm saying, but that might be of some interest. And then in terms of the world, yeah, Stevens's biography certainly I think would matter here. Um, Also curious about, as part of that biography, cancer treatments. And this is, I mean, maybe newly relevant to me since my dad died 5 years ago from cancer, and it kind of bung. I mean, he didn't die because his treatment was screwed up or messed up, but there were some hiccups in his treatment that um, continue to make me wonder about his death. And so I'm also curious about that with respect to Stevens. Not did he have bad treatment or not, but just I don't know. I'm now sort of deeply curious about what his life was like in the last several months. Okay, so I think that um, so I think that's all. We're at half an hour, so I've recorded almost an hour just on this 12 line poem, which is feels a little bonkers. Let's post this so that it's not accidentally lost. Look at all that. Just on Wallace Stevens's Of Mere Being. I think my training is showing a little bit here as a modernist scholar. All right. Well, thanks for spending more time with me and Wallace Stevens, and hey, more poems tomorrow, right?